It's truly an honor for me to be here as well, and to collaborate with Collaborative Change Coach, and all their dynamic women. This group of women is pretty empowering, actually, which is where the name for this particular presentation came from. Was just in collaboration and conversations with them. So just a little bit of background about me. I'm an experienced educator with a specialty in mindfulness and secular meditation training. So I offer programs in schools and workplaces to support and improve overall well-being. And I'm also an approved outside vendor with the Calgary Board of Education. So after studying and utilizing mindfulness to support my own well-being, I began sharing it with my colleagues and students in the classroom with profound success. I share evidence-based practices, experience, and expertise with children and adults in private or public settings. And my mission really is to help you develop practical understanding of mindfulness so that you can actually use them in your everyday life, because really it is essentially a practice. I'm also the mother of 3 young souls, and I found mindfulness after some pretty significant personal suffering. I needed some new tools in my toolbox to just address the anxiety and the overwhelm that I was experiencing. So I found yoga and meditation and mindfulness to really address the suffering and help me cultivate new ways of well-being. So as an educator, of course, I value the tenets of, the basics, reading, writing, and arithmetic. But the more time I spent as a classroom teacher, I realized that really what our students needed among these tenets were the skills of resiliency, and social emotional learning. So this really was a catalyst for me to change the direction of my career and ultimately my life choices in many ways. So after personally benefiting from the tools of mindfulness and meditation, I began to embrace the changes beyond just my classroom walls. And I launched into some formal training with Mindful Schools. I completed their Mindful Educator certification program and launched my business known as Present Possibilities so that I can serve organizations and schools in the Calgary area just to help bring more peace and ease to all of our lives is really the goal. My commitment to you today is to give you as many practical techniques and tools that you can use right away, that you can literally use tonight as you're in bed trying to fall asleep and the monkey mind is going, right? So that you have tools in your back pocket to use right away, and maybe even share with family or friends or loved ones in your family. So my commitment is to share information and resources to help you to continue and cultivate your own personal resiliency, especially in times of uncertainty. And you'll also have the opportunity to engage and reflect on your own practices and with others. When I first started in my more formal mindfulness training, I assumed that because I valued it and knew a fair amount about it and was practicing it on my own, I assumed lots of other people did as well, and was shocked when I discovered that a couple really close friends of mine didn't even know what mindfulness was, that really basic conversation of, well, what is mindfulness and why bother, right? So just because we know something to be true doesn't mean that, everybody has the same entry point. This slide, this is who I kind of deem the founding father of mindfulness, particularly in North America. His name is John Kabat-Zinn, and he's quoted as saying, the best way to capture moments is to pay attention. This is how we cultivate mindfulness. Mindfulness means being awake. It means knowing what you're doing. And I think the title, Awake and Aware Conversations for this group, it really speaks to John Kabat-Zinn and his work and his research. So in the 1970s, he opened the Stress Reduction Clinic and the Center for Mindfulness in Medicine, Healthcare, and Society at the University of Massachusetts. His work began really as a trial to help those with chronic health issues and pain. His program had such profound results in helping these people improve their quality of life. It created this incredible ripple, especially within the medical community. So mindfulness, we understand that the tenet of mindfulness, or one primary tenet of it, is that it helps us become present. And one of the reasons why this is so supportive is that it is said that depression is often the result of focusing on the past, while anxiety is often the result of focusing on the future. So when we arrive in the present moment, which is really all that we have anyway, we can truly make space from the depression and the anxiety that like to kind of hijack this present moment. It's a very challenging practice at times, because when we begin to notice, we often realize, oh yeah, I'm thinking about something from the past. I'm ruminating on that difficult conversation, right? Or I'm thinking about the future. I really could use a holiday. When can I get out of here? Right? It's very rare that we are truly in this moment alone. And when we practice or cultivate that muscle, it really is incredibly empowering and very restful also. So mindfulness is essentially a practice, just like with yoga or say tennis or soccer. It's something that we need to cultivate and practice over time to build that muscle. In this sense, it's kind of an emotional muscle or perhaps even a mental muscle, but it's a muscle nonetheless. And essentially, it's about becoming aware of the present moment without judgment. So not rejecting the experience, but just being with the experience, whether you deem it a positive experience or a negative experience. It's about becoming an observer. So maybe you're observing your internal experience, some of the emotions that you're experiencing, or maybe you're becoming an observer of your external environment where you happen to be. It could even just be in your office or in your vehicle. And research is really well stated. He has over 30 years worth of really well documented research on the benefits of mindfulness. And one of the primary benefits that they're spending a lot of time studying now is how it actually changes the neural pathways in our brains. So our brains are far more plastic than they ever thought that they were. And they're now that technology has kind of improved over the years, they're really able to measure and quantify the incredible benefits that mindfulness does have from a neural network standpoint. Mindfulness has numerous physiological and physical and mental health benefits, as well as generally improving our overall state of mind. So things like, practicing kindness and compassion for ourselves or others, just those positive mind states in general, are tenets of a mindfulness practice in general. So I'm going to walk you through this practice. We're going to do it together. Now, just like I say in all my workshops, especially if they're virtual ones like this, I always let folks know that they can turn off their screen if they like. If it feels too vulnerable to have the screen, then you can go ahead and disable the video just for this portion of the practice, and then come back when you feel ready. So this is one of the very first practices that I share in almost all of my workshops and sessions. And it was actually one of the very first practices that I learned. One of the reasons why it's so powerful is because our brains, our nervous systems, kind of run in a loop, meaning that they're just on repeat. So researchers estimate that we have about, some more, some less, depending on the individual, but on average, about 90,000 thoughts a day, which is an incredible amount in, say, a 14-hour wake period, right? The thing is that those thoughts that we're having today, those 90,000 thoughts, are pretty much the same thoughts that we had yesterday. So in order to interrupt or create new neural pathways or new habits or really create change in our life, we need to reboot that loop or reset it. And this practice is a really empowering one that helps you do that. It literally interrupts the loop. I use it for sleep. I use it when my kids are having a meltdown. I've used it in the classroom many, many times. I use it in the car, even on my way, if I'm running behind, which is usually the case, on the way to a meeting or something. It's a really powerful, powerful reset. And this is another reason why I call it the sensory reset, is because it's really a reset. So essentially what you're going to do is you're just going to simply notice and label silently in your mind 5 things that you see right here, right now, wherever you are. So you can just, without, darting around the room too much, just simply notice, in my case, I see a clock and I see a painting and I see a chair and there's a bookshelf and there's an elephant statue. Great, done. 5 done. 5 things that I hear in this moment, right here, wherever I am. I hear the clock ticking. I hear my fountain. I hear movement upstairs. I hear my breath. Might even hear the fan of the furnace. And then lastly, you feel into 5 experiences that you're having in this moment. So for me, I feel the cushion beneath me. I feel my knees. I I feel my ankles touching the floor. I feel my hands pressed together, and I even feel the hair on the back of my neck. And it's a very quick practice to help you really get into the internal experience as well as the external experience. I think sometimes, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, but there's sometimes a misconception that mindfulness or meditation has to be done in a really formal way, on a meditation cushion in silence, and there's very formalized practice. And yes, that's true. There are formalized practices, but even just tapping in to our senses is an incredibly mindful experience and has the ability to reset our nervous system in a matter of minutes. If you're someone who's prone to waking up in the middle of the night and you can't get back to sleep, try this one. Use it a couple times, and you might discover, oh, I fell back asleep. That was crazy. How did that happen? And even if you're in a dark room and there's not much to see, you might be surprised how much you see in even a very dark room, right? So I encourage you to try that. Try it again. It's like I said, it's a really quick, easy one, and something that you can do anywhere. Do it. One of my favorite places to practice a sensory reset is actually on a walk. So we live really close to a provincial park, and almost daily I try to get out there for a meditative walk and move my body and connect with nature as much as possible. And I use the sensory practice in my walk. It's tremendous. It's definitely my go-to. So yeah, that takes us to our next slide. Whether you have or choose a formal practice or an informal practice, I'd like to really remind and encourage you that both are very helpful. Both are very supportive. So while you might have time to maybe carve out a half an hour to do a formal meditation practice, you also may not have the time or the resources, right? You may not be in a state of mind where sitting in a 30-minute meditation is maybe not what's best for you in that moment or in that set of circumstances, right? And so I think there's sometimes some myths around meditation and mindfulness. We always have this, picture in our mind from social media or marketing or whatever that meditation is done on a beach alone, and it's a very Zen-like experience. And that's not always necessarily the case. I mean, it can be, but it doesn't have to be that way. It's very accessible and approachable. So that's really my objective, is to help people understand that there's a real usability factor with mindfulness. So if you have time to make time for both a formal and an informal practice, that's great. That just may not be accessible to you, and that's completely fine. I personally have both, and I find value in both. There's some days that I just can't sit for 30 minutes. My body won't allow it or my mind won't allow it, but instead, I can use the sensory reset, and maybe multiple times a day if need be. And even just simply stopping, and noticing your surroundings, maybe noticing your feet on the floor and your back on your chair, right? And then following an in-breath and an out-breath. Well, that's mindfulness. Can take 30 seconds sometimes to reset us. So this slide really illustrates that often we're in a reaction state. So often we function from a place of fight, flight, or freeze. And there's even one now that they're researching that they refer to as fawn. More often than not, when we're activated or when we are triggered, our nervous system immediately goes into fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And it's actually intelligence that's built into your body to keep you safe and protected. But the problem is that the threats that were maybe a reality back when our nervous systems evolved are not the threats that we're experiencing today. So we sometimes have a tendency to overreact to threat or deem something a threat that isn't really a threat, but our nervous systems don't know the difference. So in this slide, it says the mind-body fear response. It's real. It's a very real thing. And I often remind folks that when you're reacting, it's not you, it's your nervous system. So it's kind of like the old phrase with dating, oh, it's not you, it's me, right? Like when you're letting somebody down gently. Well, when your nervous system is acting in a way that you might not normally, respond to because you've been triggered or something, it really is not necessarily you. It's just your nervous system. So learning about the nervous system and how your nervous system really is trying to keep you safe. It's not there to cause you to get into disagreements with those that you love or colleagues. It's really actually designed to keep you safe and protected. And so often when we're in this state of fight, flight, or freeze, or often survival, even a state of survival mode, which is what many people have been experiencing with the COVID restrictions, especially our most vulnerable communities, you actually can't access the prefrontal cortex of your brain, which is responsible for all the thinking and decision making. It actually shuts it down, and you are functioning purely in that survival mode part of your nervous system, which is primarily fight, flight, or freeze, which is sometimes where we don't make our best decisions because we can't access the prefrontal cortex of our brain. So Jon Kabat-Zinn is really well known for this quote. Karen and I have used it in previous presentations, that he says, you can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf. And this really speaks to the fact that these waves are going to roll in and they're going to roll out. And some days they're, pretty mild and peaceful. And other days it is a rocky storm. With mindfulness and meditation, we can develop skills so that our nervous system doesn't want to completely hijack our way of being, that we can create a little bit of space and grace between our experiences and the stimuli, because so often it's our nervous system that just rushes in. And we can also change the patterns of our brain and our neurosystem to now develop skills to respond rather than react just from a place of maybe survival. So this next practice I want to walk you through, I call it the palm practice, and it's another really quick, easy one that you can use. Heck, you could use this in a meeting and most people wouldn't even know you were doing it. And essentially, the premise of this practice is you're going to essentially follow your breath on your hand. So when you're ready, you can go ahead and join me if you like, and you're just going to simply track your breath on the palm of your hand. So as you breathe in, and you can say it in your head silently, I breathe in, I breathe out. And within each in breath, you just track your breath up one finger. And as you breathe out, you track that breath down. I breathe in. I breathe out. I breathe in. I breathe out. I breathe in. I breathe out. And then, of course, you can switch to the other hand because we have been gifted with two hands. I breathe in. I breathe out. There's no special pace or speed here. It's really just about following your own inhale and your own exhale. I always tell kids there's no prize for the first person done. And it's truly just that quick and simple. I mean, you can do it underneath your desk. I've even taught students to do it, under their desk. And nobody has a clue that they're literally resetting their nervous system by following their breaths on their fingers. Moving on, I just always like to kind of help folks be aware of some of the myths and really essentially what mindfulness is not. So in my practice, mindfulness is not used as a disciplinary tactic. So it's not something that we use to get, people to comply, right? Or to be silent or to be quiet. That's not how it's intended. It is not only, rainbows and unicorns or calmness and happiness. Sometimes there's a misunderstanding that it's all about being positive all the time and blissful, and that's just not the case. It's also not a silver bullet for everything that ails us. So while I am very much a passionate mindfulness practitioner and educator, I believe wholeheartedly in it, I also have other tools in my toolbox that I use that I know are helpful to support me. So while it's a great tool, it's one of many available tools to us. It is not the absence of thought, so it's not about clearing your mind. It's really about noticing the thoughts, and even more so the quality of our thoughts. It is not religious, so I teach and practice secular meditation and mindfulness. It is not serious business. So some sometimes we have this belief that it's, a disciplined, focused practice, and sometimes it is. I've attended meditation silent retreats where there is definitely a formality to it and a discipline to it, and there's other practices and times at retreat when it is not about the formal or the discipline. So it's not all about, a serious business, and it's not about false positivity or just learning to be more positive and be more grateful. Some would call that spiritual bypass. I mean, this is a secular practice, but it's really about bypassing the experience that we're having so that we can make other people more comfortable. And so I always like to remind folks that this is not that. This is not about making your colleagues or your family members just more positive, right? Or ourselves for that matter. So Jack Kornfield is another one of my very favorite teachers. And he says that if your compassion does not first include yourself, it is incomplete. And along with Kristen Neff, he talks a lot about the power of self-compassion and how we really truly need to fill our own cups first. Because if our own cup is depleted, there is nothing to serve. Marie talked about servant leadership, and servant leaders, more than anybody, need their cups full, right? And we need time to refill those cups on a regular basis to do the work that is required. It really is a tool in our toolbox. And for me, I'm not sure when I learned about self-compassion, but it wasn't until I was an adult. And so much of what I've learned as an adult, I often felt like, how come I didn't learn this when I was a kid? How come they didn't teach this in school? How come this is new to me? And so much of the work I do is really about empowering not only teachers and adults, but the next generation, right? Because we have so many tools and so much to share. And there is an easier way in lots of ways. These are really, really helpful life skills in general for any age. So Kristen Neff talks about self-compassion as being the foundation of any mindfulness practice. I've developed this little 3-step process, and it's really inspired by Kristen Neff and her processes. And she's got some great resources. She's got a workbook and all sorts of other tools that you can refer to if you want to dive in a little bit more. She says that with self-compassion, we give ourselves the same kindness and care that we'd give to a good friend. And so often we don't necessarily give that to ourselves first and foremost. It's kind of a bit of a backwards approach. So the foundation of a really basic compassion practice is first noticing, right? Becoming the observer. Notice and observe. Yeah, this sucks, right? This is brutal, right? This is frustrating. Whatever the noticing happens to be, noticing the experience, noticing the emotions, and then moving to acknowledgement. So instead of saying, oh, I am mad, or I am exhausted, or I am furious, we can shift it to this is a moment of frustration, or this is a moment of anger, or this is a moment of exhaustion, rather than letting it kind of consume and wash over our entire body and being, right? When we use the language, this is a moment of, instead of I am, it's not quite as consuming. It gives a little bit of space and grace between us and the experience. And then the third step that Kristen suggests is really asking yourself, through self-inquiry, what action can I take to bring some comfort or kindness to myself? What do I need in this moment? Do I need a bubble bath, or maybe a shot of bourbon, or maybe a walk by myself, or maybe I need to hop in the car and drive and turn the music up really loud and cry and scream because I'm alone, right? Like, what do you need in that moment? What compassion and kindness do you need in that moment? And more often than not, the wisdom comes quite quickly as long as we're willing to sit and be in the space with it. And self-compassion helps us do this. So if you follow Brene Brown's work at all on compassion, she also talks a lot about boundaries, that you actually can't have compassion without having healthy boundaries. And this is another resource that I love. Her book, The Gifts of Imperfection, was one of her first books that I ever read. And I have highlighter and stars and underline all through it. It's like almost become like a personal journal, I feel like. One of the things that was such an aha for me, that of course I didn't learn until I was an adult also, was this idea in her research that many of the most truly committed compassion practitioners were also the most boundaried conscious people in all of her research, meaning that compassionate people are also boundaried people. And sometimes there's this misconception in compassion practices for ourselves or for others that we can't be boundaried. It's all about vulnerability. But Brené would say, yes, you can have vulnerability and you can have compassion and still be boundaried. Both can be true. She also asks, wouldn't it be better if we were just kinder but firmer? And how would our lives look if there was less anger and more accountability? And what would our work or home lives look like if we blamed less and had more respect for boundaries? So if you're curious about her work on vulnerability and boundaries and compassion, I really encourage you to have a look at her. And I wanted to bring in a bit of information about why boundaries are so important, especially in a leadership role, or if you're working in a compassionate role with other people. Compassion fatigue is real. It is a real deal. And so often it leads to burnout, but it doesn't have to. 81% of the workers who suffer from compassion fatigue are women. So women are more susceptible to compassion fatigue, mostly because of the work that they do, than men. There's a strong correlation or connection between secondary traumatic stress and careers that require helping others in some way. And suicide rates and burnout and turnover is much higher with people that present with STS or secondary traumatic stress disorders. And within the last year alone, now this is a stat from 2017, and I'm sure it's increased significantly, but within the last year, over 21% of those in a helping profession noted that the amount of overtime that they were required to work increased. So the demands have increased, right? Which makes compassion fatigue and burnout that much more of a challenge. Self-care can look a lot of different ways, so it can be physical, it can be mental, it can be spiritual, it can be emotional, there's a whole, this slide just shows, this vast array of what self-care can look like. And carving only an hour out of your day, which is actually, to me, when I first started having a self-compassion practice and really setting a container and boundaries for self-care, I didn't have it. We had 3 small kids under the age of 3. It just wasn't accessible. And so the idea of taking an hour seemed crazy, right? Like it just seemed like, how? I can't even get 10 minutes, an hour? But an hour, which can seem like a lot, is actually only 4.2% of your total day. So it really isn't. It feels like a lot because our day gets filled with so many other things, but it really isn't. And self-care, how it looks for you is going to look different for me. So knowing what really fills your cup, so to speak, is so key in all of that. I wanted to highlight the importance of laughter and humor, that, taking time to really laugh and be silly or playful or whatever that looks like for you. Maybe you've got children at home, so it's easier to be playful and silly. If it's watching, maybe a Netflix comedy series or something like that, but taking time to be playful and silly is really, really important because it releases dopamine and oxytocin in our brains, which essentially lifts our mood and helps us feel better overall. It also boosts our immune system. So laughter is really, really important. And if you can embed it into your mindfulness practice, then even better, right? Even better. And lastly, I'm just going to leave you with some empowering questions that I find really helpful. I've always been a very curious soul in general, and I really value the power of inquiry and question. And as a classroom teacher, I used inquiry often, but I also realize I use it on my own personal journey. And mindfulness really helps make this inquiry journey of discovery a very personal one. So another reason why I love mindfulness, right? It helps us become inquirers, become observers. And when we combine our curiosity with compassion, it's a powerful, powerful duo. So I've always loved the power of question. And so I've just shared a couple here in this slide with you that I use. So when I'm really in a sticky situation that I can't really make sense of with my mind, I use these questions, like what's right about this challenge that I'm not understanding or that I don't see right now? And I just make space for it and be with it, or is there a blessing somewhere in this mess? Because right now I don't see it, but usually in hindsight, I'm able to, oh, wait a minute, that was actually a blessing in disguise, right? Or asking yourself, can I hold gratitude for this in some way? Even if it's a really messy, uncomfortable situation, can I be grateful in some way? I think probably most of us over the last 2 to 3 months, while COVID has been very difficult and the restrictions have been hard, I think most people could probably list at least 5 things that they're pretty grateful for that this experience gave them, right? Even though it was messy and really sticky. Is there a lesson somewhere in here? And that's where the self-compassion practice is so valuable, because sometimes when there is a lesson, it can be sometimes really uncomfortable, very vulnerable. And so having a self-compassion practice when we're working through these lessons or this self-inquiry is so, so important and helpful. And I'm just going to close with the reminder that every soul really desires the same fundamental things, and they're usually pretty simple, and that we all desire to be truly seen and heard and honored. And mindfulness makes that a little bit more accessible so that we can be fully present in our homes and our businesses and our communities, so that we are able to then develop healthier relationships, maybe improve our productivity and even our engagement.